My name is Chloe Davidson, and I'm 31. Last night, I found out my entire family, yes, all 118 of them, are gathering at Lake Placid for our traditional summer trip. Everyone's invited, except me, again. Mom says it's just for immediate family this year. But I saw the guest list, business partners, family friends, people I've never even met. They even rented 2 extra villas. So what does that make me? I used to cry over texts like that, not this time. This time I saved it, not to remember the pain, but to remember the moment I stopped begging for a seat at their table and started building my own. If you've ever been the one they forgot, stay with me. This story is yours, too. I went back to work like nothing happened, like I didn't just get erased again. But as I tried to focus, my eyes kept drifting to my phone, to that message, to Noah's post. 118 confirmed. Lake Placid's gonna be wild this year. 118 people. That's not tight space. That's a damn convention. They invited distant cousins I barely remember, plus ones. College roommates from 20 years ago. My parents even rented 2 extra lakefront houses to make sure everyone had room. Everyone but me. The lie stung more than the exclusion. They didn't forget. They never forget. They just decided I wasn't worth the space. For years, I blamed myself. Maybe I wasn't successful enough. Maybe my career in design wasn't as impressive as Noah's tech firm or Olivia's perfect suburban life. Maybe I wasn't enough. But that's the thing about being left out so many times. You start to believe you deserve it. Until you don't. Until one day, like today, you hit a wall. A quiet, final wall. And you realize this isn't about you being difficult or different or dramatic. It's about them choosing comfort over connection, control over compassion. And maybe, just maybe, it's time to stop chasing the invitation and start writing your own guest list. So I saved that message. Not as proof they hurt me, but as the line in the sand. The before and after. Because something inside me had changed, not snapped, shifted. I was done trying to be good enough for people who never saw me in the first place. Let them have their curated family photos and perfect lake memories. I was going to create something else. Something that couldn't be erased. I used to think Lake Placid was a fairy tale. Every summer, we'd pile into the car, me, my siblings, and 2 distracted parents, and drive upstate to my grandparents' old house by the lake. It was a sprawling, slightly weathered place, with creaky floors, a wraparound porch, and the kind of quiet that makes your shoulders relax without asking. But for me, the magic wasn't the house. It was Grandpa Arthur. He was the only one in my family who ever really saw me. Not just tolerated me, not just nodded politely when I spoke. He saw me. I was 6 when he gave me my first set of watercolors. We were sitting on the porch, and I was sketching a crooked little pine tree with a crayon. Most adults would have said, "That's cute," and moved on. But Grandpa leaned in, studied it like a real piece of art, and said, "You have a different eye, Chloe. You notice things others don't. That's a gift." I carried that sentence with me like armor. Because back home, things felt different. Love came in specific shapes, trophies, grades, titles. My siblings fit those shapes perfectly. Noah was athletic and driven. Olivia was polished and brilliant. Ethan was effortlessly likable. They were the pride parade. I was the quiet kid with paint on her hands and ideas no one asked about. Mom and Dad weren't cruel. They were just uninterested. Polite in public, strategic in private. Their attention was currency, and it was invested where it had visible returns. But Grandpa, he made space for my world. He'd pull out books on architecture, ask about my drawings, take me to old hardware stores just to talk about textures. He made me believe my imagination wasn't just valid, it was valuable. When he died, something shifted. I was 13, and suddenly the one person who made me feel like more than a background character was gone. That summer, Lake Placid felt colder, quieter. No one asked to see my sketchbook. No one noticed I stopped painting. There's one moment I'll never forget. It was Dad's birthday the summer after Grandpa passed. I worked for days on a canvas, an oil painting of the lake at sunset, rich and layered. I wrapped it carefully, even wrote a little note. Dad opened it during cake. He glanced at it, smiled vaguely, and said, "Nice, Chloe." Then he turned to Noah and asked about his latest track meet. That was it. I nodded, smiled back, and quietly decided I'd never paint for them again. In school, the patterns got clearer. I'd bring home a B+, and Mom would purse her lips. Olivia got an A, and it was dinner conversation for a week. I was compared to cousins I barely knew. Did you hear Rebecca's doing pre-law? Your aunt says Ethan's already networking. Noah just got into the top summer business program. I wanted to scream. I got into the art elective by portfolio review. But I didn't. I just tucked the joy away in my chest, like all the other things that only mattered to me. By sophomore year, I had stopped showing them anything. I kept a folder under my bed filled with things I was proud of, contest entries, photos of my projects, notes from teachers. It was my secret archive, a museum of the self I had to protect. But that ache, the one that said, "Why not me?" never fully left. I remember walking past the living room one Saturday. Dad was helping Noah draft his resume. Olivia was showing Mom a presentation for her student council campaign. I stood in the hallway, invisible. My hands were still stained from charcoal sketches I'd been working on all morning. I turned and walked away before anyone could see me. When I told them, tentatively, that I wanted to pursue design, Mom tilted her head and said, "That's very bold of you," as if I'd confessed I wanted to join the circus. Dad chimed in with something about starving artists and maybe keep a backup plan. I smiled, said I understood, then applied to RISD behind their backs. I still remember the day the acceptance letter came. I danced in my bedroom, held the envelope to my chest like it was a love letter. When I finally told them, they blinked. "Is that a real school?" Mom asked. Dad sighed. "It's your life." That was their version of congratulations. I learned to stop expecting balloons. But the strange thing was, I didn't stop hoping. Some part of me, buried and stubborn, kept thinking maybe this award, this internship, this gallery feature would be the one that cracked through. Maybe if I made myself remarkable enough, they'd look up from Noah's job promotion and see me. But they didn't. They just kept clapping for everyone else. So I clapped for myself. Quietly, privately. Until one day I realized I couldn't hear it anymore, and that scared me. Because it wasn't just that they didn't believe in me, it was that I had started to agree with them. That realization didn't come as a thunderclap, it crept in like fog, soft, slow, smothering. I started shrinking myself to fit the room, saying less, dreaming smaller. I didn't want to give them one more thing to overlook, but I still craved something I couldn't name, just one moment of being truly seen. Not tolerated, not nodded at over a dinner plate, but seen, like Grandpa used to see me, like my art professor saw me when she pulled me aside sophomore year and said, "You have something rare? Don't let the wrong people define it." I smiled at her, but inside I was already trying to remember how to believe that. So I kept drawing, designing, building a world where I could belong. even if I was the only one living in it. Even then, I wasn't angry at my parents, not yet. Just tired of proving I was worthy of love they never intended to give. And that's the part that still haunts me. Not what they said, but what they never had to. By the time I left for college, I had mastered the art of disappearing in plain sight. I kept my achievements quiet, my emotions quieter. I didn't expect cheers or congratulations anymore, just silence, maybe an indifferent nod if I was lucky. When I got into Wrist, I didn't hold my breath waiting for their approval. I paid for what I could through scholarships, worked nights at the campus cafe, and tried not to count the number of care packages Olivia got from home, while I settled for text messages that said, "Hope you're surviving finals." But RISD gave me something my house never could: space to breathe, to be. For once, I was surrounded by people who didn't ask if art was practical. They asked about vision, message, purpose. I thrived, slowly, awkwardly, but definitely. I stayed up painting until sunrise. I cried over critiques that pushed me too far and celebrated when my professors called my work emotionally disruptive in the best way. And for a while, I thought maybe that was enough. Maybe I didn't need them to clap. I had peers, mentors, a growing sense of who I was. But then I'd win something, an award, a feature, a paid gig, and some naive part of me would still forward the link to Mom, just in case. Sometimes she replied with a thumbs-up emoji. Most times she didn't reply at all. My dad once called me, months after I had my first real client, and said, "Are you still doing that decorating thing?" Decorating. I had spent weeks designing a trauma-informed healing space for a women's center, and to him it was fluff. I wish I could say I stopped caring after that I hardened and moved on. But the truth is, you can only armor yourself so much before it starts to chafe. Graduation came. I didn't invite them. They didn't ask. I walked across that stage, took my diploma, and felt numb, proud but empty. Like the applause I really wanted had never shown up. Still, I built. I interned, freelanced, lived in a shared apartment the size of a closet. I taught myself how to invoice, negotiate, network. I failed a lot, cried even more. But each project taught me something. Each client was a win, even if no one at home noticed. I launched my own small design studio at 27. It was terrifying. I poured every penny and every ounce of belief I had into it. And it started to grow, slowly, organically. Word of mouth, Instagram. A few write-ups in niche publications. I was proud. Quietly, always quietly. One night, I texted the family group chat a photo of my first studio space. Bare walls, mismatched furniture, but mine. No one responded. 2 days later, Noah sent a video of his new Tesla. Everyone replied within minutes. That night, I cried, not out of jealousy, but grief. Grief for the version of me that still believed I could earn my way into their affection. That version died quietly. No funeral, just a steady withdrawal. After that, I stopped updating them, stopped giving them the chance to ignore me. But that doesn't mean the ache went away, because what no one tells you about being the family disappointment is that it's not always loud. Sometimes it's just a chair that's never pulled out for you, a story that never includes your name, a tradition where your absence is easier than your presence. Weddings, baby showers, holiday trips. I was often invited as an afterthought, if at all, and when I did show up, I felt like a guest in someone else's narrative. There's this one moment I can't forget. Olivia's gender reveal. She was glowing. Everyone was there. Noah, Ethan, their spouses, their kids. I brought a small gift, handmade, customized with the baby's initials. She smiled, said, "Thanks," then set it aside. Later, I watched as she opened a generic onesie from a coworker and burst into tears, hugging them like they had handed her the moon. That night, I left early. No one noticed. I went home, sat in the dark, and thought, I don't think I exist to them in the way they exist to me. That's when I began to retreat, not physically, but emotionally. I stopped reaching out, didn't comment on photos, didn't send holiday texts. I wasn't angry. I was just done playing the role of the hopeful child. And yet, every once in a while, something would crack me open again. Like when I saw the family Christmas photo from 2 years ago. Coordinated outfits, snowy background, smiles all around. I wasn't invited. When I asked gently, Mom said, "Oh, we thought you were busy with work. You didn't say you were free." I hadn't known I needed to. It was around then I realized I was no longer hurt. I was numb. And numbness is its own kind of grief. It doesn't scream. It settles, deep, quiet. That's what made the Lake Placid message sting so differently. It wasn't just exclusion, it was confirmation that they were okay, pretending I didn't exist. And I had spent too long shaping myself around their absence. But something about that silence, this time, felt like a door. Not closing, opening. Maybe for the first time, I wasn't waiting for an apology. I wasn't bracing for a change of heart that would never come. I was simply done. Done explaining. Done performing. Done hoping that one day they'd wake up and finally say, "We were wrong. We should have chosen you too." Because I was finally starting to understand something. I didn't need their seat at the table. I needed to build my own table and fill it with people who saw me the way Grandpa once did. Not because of what I achieved, but because of who I am. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of everything. When the Lake Placid message came, I didn't cry right away. I cleaned my apartment, scrubbed the bathroom tiles, rearranged bookshelves. I kept moving until my hands ached and my brain stopped spinning. Because if I stopped, I knew I'd start thinking, and thinking led straight to pain. Later that night, I sat on the floor with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders and stared at the message again. Not because I expected it to change, but because I couldn't believe how familiar it felt. Different year, same rejection. I typed out a dozen responses, sarcastic ones, polite ones, devastating ones, then deleted them all. What was the point? They had already made their choice. It felt like I had no one, no anchor. I was drifting through a life I'd carefully built, surrounded by beautiful things I had created, and yet completely alone. That kind of loneliness doesn't scream. It whispers, in the empty chairs, in the echo of your own voice, in the birthday cake you bought yourself because no one remembered. A few days later, I was still in that haze when I got a voice message from Sarah, my former mentor at the firm where I'd interned right after college. She always called me kid, even though I was in my 30s. Her voice had that warmth, like tea with whiskey in it, steady, honest. "Hey kid, just thinking about you. Don't know why, maybe it's the universe. Anyway, if you ever want to talk or rant, I'm here, and if not, that's okay too." I stared at the waveform. I hadn't spoken to her in over a year, but she always had this weird sixth sense. I called her the next morning. We talked for 2 hours about clients, life, burnout, and then, quietly, haltingly, I told her about the message. There was a long pause. Then she said, "Damn, I'm so sorry, Chloe." She didn't offer cliches. She didn't say, "They probably didn't mean it." She said the thing I needed most. "That sucks, and it's not okay." We sat in silence for a bit. Then she said something I didn't expect. You know, maybe it's time to stop trying to fit into their version of family. Maybe it's time to build your own. I laughed bitterly. With who? IKEA chairs and a dog? But she didn't laugh. She said, "You've been making beautiful spaces for other people for years. What would it look like if you made one for yourself?" I didn't answer right away, because something about that landed hard. What would it look like? A space that celebrated creativity, that healed, that welcomed people who felt like outcasts. A place where being different wasn't a liability. It was the whole point. That night, I stayed up sketching, not for a client, for me. I didn't know what I was drawing yet, but my hand moved before I could overthink it. Curves, layers, textures, light. I imagined a retreat, not a vacation, but a transformation. A place for people like me who had been made to feel too much, too strange, too inconvenient. It was a wild idea, irrational, expensive, but it pulsed with something I hadn't felt in years: purpose. I texted Sarah a photo of the sketch. She replied, "That's the start of something. I can feel it." The next morning, I looked at apartments to sublet. I needed space, mental, physical. Then I started researching properties upstate. I wasn't sure where this was going, but I knew I couldn't stay where I was anymore, emotionally or otherwise. A few nights later, I got a text from Emily, a friend I'd met years ago during a design workshop. We had stayed in loose contact, liking each other's posts, sending birthday messages. She was one of those rare people who made you feel instantly safe. Her message read, "Hey stranger, random question. If you could design anything without limits, what would it be?" I stared at the screen. Then I called her. We talked for hours. And somewhere between laughter and tears, I told her everything. Not just about the retreat, but about my family. The ache, the message, the silence. She didn't flinch. She said, "If you do this, I'm helping. I'll bring snacks and wine and power tools. Let's build something for the weirdos and the dreamers." I laughed so hard I cried. For the first time in a long while, I felt seen, not for who I was supposed to be, but for who I actually was. And that, right there, was the beginning of something new. The next few weeks were a blur of movement. I started waking up with energy again. Not joy exactly, but momentum. I researched retreats across the country, jotted notes on what worked, what didn't. I pulled images, textures, color palettes into folders. I bought a giant corkboard and pinned everything to it like a detective chasing a lead. And I started talking, really talking. Emily introduced me to Jessica, an event planner who specialized in wellness spaces. We grabbed coffee one afternoon, and after hearing my idea, she leaned across the table and said, "This is brilliant. I've been waiting for a project like this." She wasn't just being nice, she had vision, strategy. Her brain lit up alongside mine, and by the time we finished our second coffee, we were already bouncing ideas off each other like we'd been collaborating for years. That night, I opened my old sketchbooks and filled 3 pages with a name: Creative Mindset Retreat. A space where healing met imagination. Where people came not to escape, but to come home to themselves. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about showing anyone what they'd missed. It was about building the place I had always needed and offering it to others. There was still doubt, of course, still that little voice that whispered, "What if it fails?" But for the first time, there was another voice, steadier, kinder. What if it works? I pinned that question to the center of my board, and I got to work. Finding the perfect location for the retreat wasn't easy. I must have toured a dozen properties, some too small, others too remote, and a few that felt like someone else's dream, not mine. But then came Meadowbrook. It was tucked at the edge of a sleepy lakeside town, about 20 minutes from the same Lake Placid, where my family was so fond of pretending I didn't exist. I almost skipped the listing out of pure reflex, but curiosity got the better of me. The moment I stepped onto the grounds, something in me shifted. The house was old but proud, with ivy curling up stone columns and massive windows that caught the light just right. A winding path led down to the water, framed by trees that whispered when the breeze passed through. It wasn't perfect. The kitchen needed updating, the floors creaked, there was a family of raccoons in the attic. But it felt right, like a place waiting to become something more. I sent photos to Emily. Her reply, "This is it. It has a heartbeat." With Jessica's help, we crunched numbers, negotiated like our lives depended on it, and pulled every favor we could. Sarah even connected me with a quiet investor who believed in wellness with purpose. I still don't know how we pulled it off, but 2 months later, Meadowbrook was mine. And just like that, the real work began. We started small, cleaning, painting, making lists so long they curled at the edges. There were late nights filled with pizza, mocktails, and playlist debates. Mornings began with construction noise and coffee that tasted like sawdust, but I loved it. For the first time in years, I woke up excited, not just to survive the day, but to shape it. Emily was everywhere at once, measuring furniture, calming stressed-out contractors, sneaking brownies into the fridge with notes that said, "Eat or I'll lecture you." Jessica took over logistics like she was born to manage chaos. She knew every vendor in the county, had spreadsheets for everything, and kept our momentum sharp. I wasn't alone. More than that, I was supported. One day, disaster hit. Our catering partner pulled out a week before our first preview weekend. Panic buzzed through the house like electricity. We had guests booked, journalists, potential collaborators. I sat on the porch and stared out at the lake, that old pit of shame rising again. The voice that said, "Of course it's falling apart. You really thought you could pull this off." But before I could spiral, Emily sat beside me and said, "You don't have to fix this alone." She pulled out her phone and called Olivia. Not my sister, but her friend Olivia, a rising star chef who'd just left a toxic restaurant job and was looking for something different. 3 hours later, Olivia showed up at Meadowbrook with 2 crates of fresh ingredients and 0 patience for indecision. She surveyed the kitchen, tied up her curls, and said, "All right, where's the fire?" I watched her move through that space with quiet confidence, turning chaos into order, transforming leftover produce into magic. Her food wasn't just good, it was grounding, honest, healing. At dinner, we sat around a mismatched table, me, Jessica, Emily, Olivia, and 2 volunteers who'd spent the afternoon assembling furniture and laughing at my terrible playlist. Someone made a toast, someone else cried, and I realized this was it. This was the thing I'd spent my whole life searching for. A room full of people who weren't related by blood, but connected by choice. Kindness, shared vision, mutual respect, family, built, not born. Over the next few weeks, the space evolved. Rooms became sanctuaries, walls filled with art from local creators. We added journals to nightstands, lit candles that smelled like pine and eucalyptus and hope. Guests started trickling in, people who felt misplaced, misunderstood, or simply tired of pretending they were okay. They came for creativity, for rest, for reconnection, and Meadowbrook held them gently, bravely. One afternoon, I walked the property alone. The sun was dipping low, casting golden light through the trees. I passed the meditation deck we'd built near the lake and heard soft laughter from the journaling nook. And for the first time in my life, I felt it. Not the ache of being uninvited, but the calm of belonging, not to a family, to myself. And the life I was building, one brick, one wild dream, one imperfect, beautiful soul at a time. That night, I journaled for the first time in months. Not about my family, not about the pain, about possibility. I wrote about color palettes that evoked calm without dulling joy, about hosting weekend workshops led by trauma-informed artists, about building a lending library of creative tools for people who couldn't afford to experiment, about placing a blank canvas in every room and letting guests paint whatever they felt. I didn't know how it would all unfold, but I knew why it mattered. Because for people like me, the ones who never got to speak at the dinner table, who were edited out of family photos, who learned to celebrate in private, having a space that says, "You matter here, you're not too much, you're exactly enough," can change everything. And maybe, if Meadowbrook could do that for someone else, then all the times I went unseen wouldn't be in vain. That thought made me cry. Not out of sadness, but release. Grief, yes, but also grace. Because even though I hadn't been chosen by the people who were supposed to love me first, I was finally learning how to choose myself. And that was a revolution. The next morning, I stood barefoot on the deck, coffee in hand, wrapped in an old sweater that smelled like lavender and wood smoke. The lake was still. The house was quiet. My heart wasn't racing. For once, I wasn't waiting for anyone's approval. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. And for the first time, I believed it. The opening weekend of the Creative Mindset Retreat came faster than any of us were ready for, and somehow everything came together. Guests arrived just before golden hour, their faces carrying that familiar mix of curiosity and exhaustion. Some were artists, others were teachers, social workers, burned-out entrepreneurs. But what they all had in common was this quiet ache, like they'd spent too long pretending not to feel deeply. We welcomed them with tea and homemade bread. Olivia had outdone herself in the kitchen. Jessica led an evening grounding session. Emily floated between rooms, making sure everyone felt held. And me? I stood off to the side for a while, overwhelmed by the fact that it was real. It was working. On the second day, someone posted a video of our journaling nook on Instagram. Then someone else shared a photo of their painting drying in the sunroom. By the end of the weekend, the hashtag Soka Creative Mindset Retreat had over 4,000 impressions and counting. I didn't think much of it until Monday morning when I checked my phone and saw a message from Noah. "Did you seriously rent a house near Lake Placid? Like right near ours?" I stared at the screen. Not a congrats, not a how are you, just territorial suspicion. I didn't reply. A few hours later, I got another message, this time from Mia, my cousin. "Wait, are you the one running that creative retreat everyone's talking about? That place looks incredible. Mom says it's like 5 minutes from the main lodge." Then came the ripple. More messages, indirect, passive-aggressive, some confused, others just nosy. But the theme was the same. Chloe is nearby and doing something that doesn't involve us. By Tuesday, I got a voicemail from my mother. Her tone was flat, like she was trying not to sound bothered. "Just heard from Eleanor that you're doing something creative upstate, near Lake Placid. It would have been nice to know. We're all gathering this weekend. You should stop by if you're free." I stood frozen in the kitchen, phone in hand. "Stop by? Like I was a neighbor, like I hadn't been excluded from that same gathering for years. I didn't answer. I didn't even feel angry, just clear. That night, the air turned crisp. Guests gathered around the fire pit, passing mugs of spiced cider, telling stories that made me laugh so hard, my ribs hurt. And then, just before I could turn in for the night, Olivia ran up to me. "Someone's here asking for you," she said. I stepped out onto the front steps, unsure what to expect. And there she was, D. Eleanor. She wore a linen scarf, leather boots, and that familiar look of quiet mischief in her eyes. "I figured you wouldn't come to them, so I came to you," she said. I hugged her, harder than I expected. We sat in the library sipping tea while everyone else drifted to bed. She didn't ask about my parents. She asked about Meadowbrook, about the mission, about the people, and then she looked me in the eye and said, "You know, your grandparents would have loved this place. They were always proud of you. Arthur kept one of your sketches in his wallet until the day he passed." My throat tightened. "Really?" I whispered. She nodded. "They saw you, Chloe, even when your parents refused to." I didn't cry. I breathed, deep, full. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe my worth wasn't something I had to perform for. D. Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out a small leather notebook. "This was your grandfather's. I think it belongs here now." Inside were sketches, notes, ideas, scribbled floor plans, and thoughts about light and space. I ran my fingers over the paper, stunned. "This place," she said softly, "isn't about proving them wrong. It's about honoring what's always been right about you." She left the next morning before breakfast, quiet as she came, but her words stayed with me. The retreat entered its second week, buzzing with more guests, more stories, more connection. Meadowbrook was no longer a concept, it was breathing, alive, and so was I. That Friday, my mother sent another message. "Eleanor told us about your project. Impressive. Maybe next year we can find a way to include you in the lake gathering." Include me. As if I was an extra. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened Grandpa's notebook again. On the last page was a simple line in his handwriting. "Home is where you're allowed to be fully yourself." I smiled, because finally I had one. That night, I walked the property alone. The wind was cool, but I didn't feel cold. I felt grounded, like I had finally stepped into something I didn't have words for yet. Not power, not pride, just peace. The house glowed behind me, full of laughter and lamplight. Inside were people who saw me, not as a role to be played, but as a person, whole, imperfect, enough. I thought back to every moment I'd stood on the outside looking in, at dinners, holidays, family trips, every time I wondered what was wrong with me, why I couldn't just fit. And now I didn't want to fit. I wanted to expand, to take up space without apology, to offer others what I had built for myself, a seat that was never conditional, a room where no one had to earn their welcome. When I returned to the porch, I paused, looked out toward the other side of the lake. Somewhere across the water, they were gathering again. But this time I wasn't waiting for them to notice. Because this time I was choosing myself, and that was enough, more than enough. It happened on a Sunday. The retreat was midway through its third weekend, and the house buzzed with quiet energy. Guests were in workshops. Olivia was prepping a farm-to-table brunch. I was in the garden, resetting the flower arrangements, when Jessica walked out onto the porch, phone in hand, brows lifted. You have visitors." I blinked. "Who?" She gave me a look. "Your parents. They're in the driveway." I froze, not because I was afraid, but because for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small. I just felt ready. They were exactly how I remembered. Dad in a pressed collared shirt and sunglasses, Mom in a cream cardigan, and the kind of polite expression that masked judgment with a smile. They stood in the gravel like they were assessing a country club, not a space I built with scraped knuckles and sleepless nights. "Chloe," Mom said with practiced warmth, "this place is charming." I didn't smile. "It's mine." Dad looked around, arms crossed. "Impressive. Quite the project. We didn't realize you were doing something on this scale." "Because you never asked," I said calmly. A pause. "We're here because we heard you were nearby," Mom offered, "and we thought, why not stop in? It's good to see you." But it wasn't a visit. It was an inspection. They weren't here for me. They were here because my presence, my success, had become inconveniently visible. Still, I invited them in. I led them through the main house, through the workshop room where guests were painting in silence, through the kitchen where Olivia was plating hand-pulled focaccia with wild herbs, through the reflection deck with its curved wood beams and handwritten affirmations pinned to the wall. They said little. Dad gave curt nods. Mom commented on the landscaping. When we reached the main lounge, I stopped. "Why are you really here?" I asked. Mom blinked. "Excuse me?" "You haven't reached out in months. You didn't respond when I shared photos of this space. But now that it's gaining attention, you show up, without calling, and act like this is normal." Dad stiffened. "That's unfair." "Is it?" I said, my voice steady. "You told me design wasn't a real career, that I needed a backup plan, that I was being unrealistic. You left me out of family trips, holidays, conversations, for years." Mom sighed. "Chloe, don't do this." "I'm not doing anything," I said. "I'm telling the truth, something we don't do very often in this family." Silence. "You made it clear a long time ago that I didn't belong," I added. "So I stopped trying. I built something instead." Dad looked around again, slower this time. "This place, it's impressive. I'll admit that." I nodded. "It is, but I didn't build it to impress you." Another pause. "I built it because I needed a home, and I realized no one was going to build it for me." I could see the cracks in their composure. Mom's smile faltered, Dad's jaw twitched, and I didn't feel guilty. I felt clear. Mom stepped forward. "We've made mistakes, but we were trying to protect you from failure, from disappointment." "No," I said. "You were trying to shape me into someone who wouldn't embarrass you, someone who fit your narrative." I gestured to the space around us. This is who I am. Not perfect, not polished, but real. And if that's still uncomfortable for you, that's your discomfort to carry." A beat passed, then another. For once, no one interrupted me. Dad cleared his throat. "Well, it's good to see you standing on your own." It sounded almost like respect. Almost, but I didn't need it. I didn't need anything from them. Mom reached into her purse. "Here, we brought something, just a little gift." She held out a small box. I took it, opened it. Inside was a charm bracelet, one of those generic department store pieces. Hearts and stars, like they picked it up in a rush. I closed the box and handed it back. "Thank you, but I have everything I need here." She looked stunned. Not angry, just unfamiliar with this version of me. And maybe that was the point. I walked them to the door. They didn't ask for a tour again. They didn't ask to stay for lunch, and I didn't offer. Before they left, Dad turned. "You've built something here, Chloe, something real. We'll keep in touch." I nodded once and watched as they walked away. No fireworks, no screaming, no tears, just truth, just me, standing in the doorway of a life I built, not waiting to be chosen anymore, just choosing myself again and again and again. After they left, I didn't collapse. I didn't replay the conversation 1,000 times. I didn't wish I'd said something better, sharper, kinder. I just stood there for a while, quiet, whole. Emily came to find me later with 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to me, didn't ask anything, just sat beside me on the porch steps. After a long pause, I said, "They came." "I know," she replied. "We all gave you space." Another pause. "I said everything I needed to," I added. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. And I believed her. That night, I wrote in my journal, not about them, but about me, about how clarity doesn't always arrive like thunder. It sometimes comes in the stillness after, in the knowing that you were finally heard, even if the echoes don't last. And I made a quiet promise to myself that this would be the last time I explained my worth to people, determined not to see it. Because now I was standing in a life where I didn't need to audition. I was already cast. I was already home. The day after my parents left Meadowbrook, the house felt quieter than usual. Not empty, but settled. Guests were still here, sharing breakfast and poems, watering plants, scribbling quietly in journals. But inside me, something had shifted. I no longer felt like I was waiting for a phone call, for a nod of approval, for someone to choose me. I had chosen myself, and that choice echoed everywhere. By lunchtime, the messages started coming in. First was Ethan. "So Mom and Dad visited you. They looked rattled. What the hell happened?" I stared at the screen. No greeting, no curiosity about the retreat. Just a vague defense of the parents who had spent years ignoring me. Then came Olivia. "I heard you were a little harsh. You could have handled that better." She followed up with a voice note, her tone clipped. "Mom was upset. She said you embarrassed them, that you acted like a stranger." I didn't reply, because what could I possibly say to that? Then Mia, sweet, confused Mia. "Chloe, I'm honestly just trying to understand. Everyone's acting weird. What's going on?" And then Noah. His message was different. "Hey, I heard from Mom. I don't know exactly what happened, but I think you were right to say your piece. I'm sorry I wasn't there more, that I didn't speak up." I sat with that one for a long time. It didn't erase anything, but it softened something sharp in me. I replied, "Thank you for saying that." That was it. I didn't elaborate. I didn't offer closure, because not everything needed to be reopened. By evening, I got one final surprise. Caleb. He showed up at Meadowbrook unannounced, holding 2 coffees and a tote bag filled with pastries. "I told them I needed a break," he said. "Too much wine and not enough truth over there." He plopped down in the sunroom and looked around. "This place feels like an exhale." We talked for hours. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't pick sides. He just listened. And when I finished, he said, "I think this is the first time I've ever seen you look like yourself." That meant more than he probably knew. The next day, I took a long walk through the property. I stopped by the lake, sat under the willow tree, and I asked myself a question that had once haunted me. What if they never change? And for the first time, the answer didn't terrify me, because I wasn't waiting anymore. I could grieve who they never were, and still move forward. I could honor my sadness, without letting it lead me. That week, I created a new section on our website, Our Story. I wrote about the retreat's roots, not the pain, but the purpose, not the rejection, but the resilience. I told the truth in my own words, without bitterness, without shame, and I posted a photo. It was me, standing barefoot in the garden, holding a paintbrush in one hand and a mug of tea in the other. Behind me was Meadowbrook, alive, sun-drenched, loved. I didn't tag anyone. I didn't send it to the family group chat, but they saw it. I know they did. The silence afterward was louder than any reply. And that was okay, because silence, I had learned, didn't mean absence. Sometimes it meant freedom. Later that night, I opened Olivia's message again. I didn't reply out of anger. I replied with clarity. I'm not here to protect Mom's feelings anymore. I'm here to protect my own peace. If that makes me the villain in your version of events, so be it. I didn't expect a response, and none came, and strangely, that felt like a win. Boundaries weren't walls. They were doors with locks I finally learned how to use. I didn't slam them shut. I just stopped leaving them wide open for people who kept tracking in mud. A few days later, I got a card in the mail. No return address, just a plain envelope with my name. Inside was a simple note. You are more than enough, always have been, always will be. Keep going. I didn't need to know who sent it. I already believed it. At the next staff meeting, I shared something new with the team. I want to start offering scholarships, I said. For people who've been told their creativity doesn't matter. For people like I used to be. The room lit up. Jessica said, "We'll find the budget." Olivia clapped. Emily got teary. And I realized I had built more than a place. I had built a mirror for others to see themselves in. A soft landing, a home, and best of all, it didn't require anyone's permission. Not anymore. That night, as I closed the retreat journal, I looked out across the garden, glowing under strands of soft light, and smiled. No one needed to applaud. No one needed to understand why I walked away. Because I knew the courage it took to stay soft after being cut, to remain open after being closed out, to choose peace in a family that confused silence with love. And I knew this life I was building wasn't a rebellion, it was a return to myself. The retreat officially ended on a quiet Sunday afternoon, but no one really wanted to leave. Some lingered with slow goodbyes, hugging each other like lifelong friends. Others asked if they could help fold blankets or refill the herb jars. A few just sat in the garden, letting the silence stretch. I didn't rush anyone, because I understood what it felt like to leave a place that had finally made you feel safe. After the last guest pulled away, I stayed outside, shoes off, jeans rolled up, feet in the cool grass. The sun was warm. The breeze smelled like rosemary and soil. Somewhere in the kitchen, Olivia was singing off-key. Jessica was probably reorganizing the supply closet for the 5th time. And Emily, she was napping on the hammock with a book over her face. It wasn't just peace, it was joy, gentle, unassuming, quietly radical. I sat on the porch and opened my journal, the same one I had used during the very first sketch of Meadowbrook. I flipped to a blank page, and I wrote one sentence. I'm not broken, I was just never seen clearly. Then I closed it and let the words settle. Over the next few days, we eased into a new rhythm. We kept Meadowbrook open for smaller, more personal visits. A woman from Vermont came to finish her poetry manuscript. A father and daughter booked a weekend to reconnect after a year of strained silence. A high school art teacher came just to sleep and walk and paint. Each story was different, but the core was the same. They were looking for space, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. And we had built it. One morning, I woke up before sunrise and walked down to the lake. The water was still. Fog curled along the shore. I stood at the edge and watched the light, creep across the surface, slow and golden and soft. That's when I felt it, that fullness in the chest, that quiet pressure behind the eyes, not sadness, gratitude. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about who wasn't here. I was thinking about who was. Emily, who stalked the tea shelf like a ritual. Jessica, who noticed when someone needed space without them saying a word. Olivia, who turned food into language. Sarah, who sent handwritten postcards even when she had no time. And me, the version of me who had finally stopped apologizing for taking up space. I spent that week tending the garden, weeding, trimming, planting new herbs. I got dirt under my nails and didn't care. I let my hair go wild. I wore soft cotton and bare feet and smiles that didn't ask for anything in return. I started a new practice, writing tiny notes to myself and tucking them into the drawers of the guest rooms. You are not too much. Your softness is not a weakness. Welcome home. I didn't sign them. I didn't need to. One afternoon, while refilling the lemon water station, I found a note someone had left behind on the counter. Thank you for creating a place where I didn't have to pretend. I stood there for a long time, holding that paper like a treasure, because that had been the goal all along, to create a space where people didn't have to armor up, where they could arrive exactly as they were and still be enough. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, it wasn't Instagram perfect, but it was real. And real, I was learning, was more than enough. That evening, I sat down with Emily on the porch as the sky turned lavender. She sipped tea from her chipped mug and nudged my foot with hers. You look lighter, she said. I feel different, I admitted, but not in a dramatic way, just quieter. She nodded. Sometimes healing sounds like silence. I didn't respond. I just watched the fireflies flicker in the grass and let her words land. Later, I took out a small canvas and started painting for the first time in months. Not for an exhibit, not for a deadline, just for me. No sketches, no planning, just brush to color, color to canvas. It was abstract, wild, honest, and when I finished, I felt like I had finally spoken. A language my body had been trying to remember. In the following days, I began to reflect on my own rituals. I drank tea slowly. I read poems aloud. I began therapy sessions again, not because I was breaking, but because I was growing. And I stopped trying to prove anything to anyone. I realized I didn't need to forgive my family to move forward. I just needed to forgive myself for believing for so long that their blindness was my fault. That insight came one morning while I was pruning the lavender bush near the meditation deck. The air was thick with dew. A guest walked by and whispered, "This place saved me." I smiled. It saved me too. But the truth was I had saved myself, with time, with help, with stubborn softness. And I wasn't done. Because healing, I was learning, wasn't a finish line. It was a practice, a decision I kept making, day after day, with every deep breath, every boundary, every kind word I gave myself. And for the first time, I didn't feel behind. I felt home, here, in myself, exactly as I am. That night, I stood at the window and watched the moonlight pour across the hallway floors. There were no voices in my head trying to rewrite the day. No echoes of what I should have said or done, just stillness. And in that stillness, I knew something sacred had taken root. I was no longer surviving my past. I was living my present. And ready, genuinely ready, to start building the future, not alone, but surrounded by the people I chose, the ones who chose me back. 2 weeks after the retreat season ended, I was sweeping the porch when I saw a familiar car slow down near the gate. It was my parents. I didn't feel fear, or anger, just a quiet curiosity. They parked but didn't get out right away. I waited, gave them space. Finally, they stepped out, tentative, awkward. Mom held a casserole dish like it was a peace offering. Dad looked like he regretted coming the moment his feet hit gravel. "We thought we'd stop by," Mom said. "Thought you might need help with cleanup." I didn't roll my eyes. I didn't flinch. I just said, "It's already done." I didn't invite them inside. I walked with them to the garden instead. It was blooming, lavender, rosemary, marigolds. The air smelled like safety. We sat on the bench near the willow tree. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Mom said, "We've been thinking about what you said at the house." I let the silence do the heavy lifting. Dad cleared his throat. "It caught us off guard, the way you stood there, spoke so clearly." "You weren't used to me being clear," I replied. "You were used to me trying to earn something." They didn't argue. "I don't want anything from you," I added. "Not apologies, not explanations, not a second chance." Mom's face faltered. "Then why are we here?" "To give you a choice," I said. "You can know me, the real me, or you can keep holding on to the version you prefer, but you don't get both." That was my line, my truth. No rage, no accusations, just clarity. They didn't respond right away. Instead, they looked around. "You've built something beautiful," Dad said eventually. Mom nodded. "I didn't know this was possible. For you. I didn't let myself believe it." That part almost hurt, but I let it pass. "Belief doesn't change what I've built," I said. "This exists, with or without your understanding." They didn't stay long, didn't try to extend the visit. When they left, they said goodbye quietly. No promises, no illusions, just reality. And that was enough. After they drove away, I walked into the main house. Emily was in the lounge, rearranging pillows. Jessica was on the phone with a vendor. Olivia was in the kitchen, chopping something fragrant. I stepped into the center of the room and just watched them. Noticed how each of them had become something I never thought I'd have. Family, not by blood, but by choice. That evening, we had dinner together. Nothing fancy, roasted vegetables, lentils, wine. We ate on the porch, laughing over bad playlist choices and someone's failed attempt at yoga that morning. Halfway through, I raised my glass. "To the ones who saw me before I did." They raised theirs back, and never stopped. That weekend, we hosted a volunteer build day. People came from all over, former guests, local artists, students, neighbors. We planted trees, built benches, painted new signs. One teenager who had come to the retreat with her social worker months ago hugged me and said, "I didn't think I'd ever belong anywhere, but now I do." I cried later in the privacy of my office. Happy tears? Because it was working, not just for me, for others. And that was the dream. A few days later, I sat down with Sarah, my mentor, the one who planted the seed. "I think it's time," I told her, "to expand, a second location maybe, or a mobile version. Take the retreat to places that need it." She grinned. "I was wondering when you'd say that." Growth didn't scare me anymore, because now I wasn't building from pain. I was building from peace. That week, I framed Grandpa Arthur's sketch, the one Dee Eleanor gave me, and hung it near the front entrance. Underneath, I added a small plaque. "You are already home." Every guest saw it when they arrived. Every person read it on their way out. And every time I passed it, I smiled, because now it wasn't a hope, it was the truth. That night, I stood by the windows and watched the lights in the garden flicker as guests moved in and out of the retreat center. They didn't know what it took to build this. They didn't know the loneliness, the rejection, the the nights I questioned everything, and they didn't need to, because they saw what mattered, the space, the intention, the welcome. Later, Emily sat beside me on the stairs with 2 mugs of tea and said, "You know, I used to think family was fate, that it was something fixed." I looked at her, and now? She smiled. "Now I know it's choice, and I keep choosing this." I nodded. Me too. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had to earn someone's loyalty, or affection, or presence. They stayed because they wanted to. They saw me, not the version they preferred, but the whole truth. The sharp edges and the soft insides, the girl who was once invisible, and the woman who now builds spaces so no one else has to feel that way again. In the journal I kept for the retreat, I added one last entry that week. Healing isn't just about letting go of the pain, it's about letting yourself receive joy without suspicion. And as I wrote that, I knew this wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of a new one. One I would write with steady hands, an open heart, and surrounded, finally, by people who called me by my real name, Whole. Some stories don't end with grand reunions or picture-perfect forgiveness. Some stories end quietly, with a woman standing in her garden, holding her own hand. That's mine. I didn't get the apology I once cried for. I didn't hear the words I used to rehearse responses to. But I got peace. I got presence. I got to rewrite the story, not to erase the pain, but to give it context, to say, yes, that happened. And still I rose. There's a version of me that once believed love had to be earned, that I had to shrink to fit, that I had to wait for permission to be who I was. She's gone now. In her place is someone who knows the sound of her own voice, who protects her softness like the sacred thing it is, who builds safe spaces and lets others rest inside them. Not because I was born brave, but because I was broken and decided not to stay that way. If you're listening to this and some part of you recognizes my story, this is for you. You don't need their validation to begin. You don't need the people who hurt you to heal. You don't need to explain why you walked away. You only need one thing, to believe that you are allowed to stop proving and start being. You're allowed to build your own table. You're allowed to belong to yourself. And the right people? They'll meet you there, not because you performed, but because you existed. And that was always enough. You don't need to become loud to be powerful. You can be soft and still take up space. You can be kind and still set boundaries that don't bend for guilt or obligation. That's the lesson Meadowbrook gave me. Not just the physical space, but the way it reflected what I needed to believe. That I was already enough, even when no one said it out loud. For years, I measured myself through the eyes of people who refused to see me. Now I measure by how deeply I breathe when I'm alone, by how gently I treat myself on hard days, by how freely I laugh when no one's watching, and by how many people walk through our retreat doors and say, "This feels like something I never knew I needed." To anyone who's ever been told they're too sensitive, too strange, too stubborn, you're not too much. You are just in the wrong room. Find or build the right one. You'll know you're there when you stop asking what's wrong with you and start remembering everything that's right. So here's to the spaces we create, to the silence we unlearn, to the stories we reclaim, page by page, breath by breath. You are not behind, you are not broken, you are becoming, and you are not alone. Have you ever been the one they overlooked? The one who stayed quiet, kept giving, and still wasn't enough? If this story echoes your truth, even just a little, leave a comment below. You don't have to explain everything. Just type, "I'm choosing myself now." That's more than enough. And if you've already built your own version of peace, share it. Your words might be what someone else needs to take their first step. Like, share, and subscribe if this story moved you. Let's keep healing together.